Bonjour. Bonjour.
Hello, and thank you to everyone for being with us today for this session devoted to contemporary Asia. My name is Madoka Kitamatsu. I work for the Japanese journal Nikkei in Paris. We have 5 speakers with us today. They all come from various backgrounds so that we can be up to the challenge for the complexity of the issue. So all the way to the left, Mr. Ravindran Go, founder of the Asian Network. This is a business network. Then we have Mr. Yejun Chung, who is manager at KITA, the Korean International Trade Association, which federates 1,800 Korean businesses. And then next to him we have Yuan Jakai, who is the executive director of the Finance Center for South-South Cooperation, an NGO based in Hong Kong. He is also the founder of Shanghai Ethno-Philanthropy Foundation. Mr. Jandanas Devan, hello, director of the Institute of Policy Studies of the University of Singapore, and for a long time he was also the communication director of the Singaporean government, and Dr. Kanta Pavi, who is the Minister for Women's Affairs of Cambodia since 2004. She was one of the main players of women's empowerment in the country. And then we have Marie-Françoise Renard, who is an emeritus professor at the University of Clermont-Auvergne and a researcher at the CERD, and is working on the economic growth of the region. So let's start talking about Asia, which has vulnerabilities but also huge growth, and Marie-Françoise will start this debate. Thank you. Hello everyone. I'm sorry I cannot see you because of the lights, but the question that is asked to us is that of development, and more precisely the ability of Asian countries to make sure their populations benefit from the absolutely remarkable progress that is that of Asia for several years now. In 2025, Asia was the main engine of global growth, to which it participated up to 60%. Since the 70s and 80s, industrialization as well as relocalization of production factors explain this situation. High investment, high openness, economic openness, and strong states have led to industrial ecosystems that are very performant. The concept of a developing or a state that is a developer is the idea of a state that is strategic, that is able to come up with development policies and industrial policies, able to implement them, and able to rely on institutions that it controls. That's how these industrial policies were put in place in a very targeted way and in a very efficient way, as we know. Some of these countries currently are leaders in innovation. For example, 6 Asian countries are among the 10 major financial centers in the world, and they decided to specialize in new technologies, which meant Asia was very present in promising sectors like AI, but also in robotics and e-commerce, and in everything having to do with the economy's decarbonation, sectors in which China is a global leader, but also Taiwan, who is a leader in semiconductor sectors. So the result is clear. In spite of tariffs being imposed by President Trump, in spite of an international climate marked with uncertainties, which means economic decisions are very difficult to make, Asia showcased a very strong resilience. It even increased its market shares, and that thanks to artificial intelligence. But that specialization also leads to vulnerabilities, considering that the international climate is more uncertain. We've seen the issues that were created by the closure of the Strait of Hormuz for the supply of raw material. We could also talk of the fears of China dominating other Asian countries, but Asia's vulnerabilities right now are mostly internal. The economic dynamic tends to hide high disparities between the countries, between Bangladesh and South Korea, but above all, very profound vulnerabilities internally that stop those countries from moving from growth to development. And that's what the Human Development Index of UNDP indicates. Aside from GDP, it also integrates education or health elements. And according to that index, Singapore is occupying the 12th rank in the world, but big countries like India or Indonesia are at the 130th rank out of 193 countries. And Asia is also the second region in the world with the highest number of poor people. It is also the region with the highest inequalities. The wealth is very much concentrated at the top of the pyramid, and redistribution is always made at the loss of women. An economist analyzed this, Amartya Sen, a Nobel Prize for Economy, and he explained that even if you have an income that's higher than that of the average wage, you can be deprived of your rights, deprived of your ability to exercise your rights. And that is particularly the case in Asia, where populations are particularly vulnerable to climate change. And that situation is worsened by the fact that climate change leads to deprivations, which increases their vulnerability in terms of housing and diet. And Sen adds to that analysis the idea that we should have multidimensional indicators, because poverty is not just about income, it's also about rights. That vulnerability is particularly visible in the labor market, to which many youth do not have access, especially in the formal sector. Yet there could not be any development without including the general population and without making sure the youth can hope their situation will improve. And the lack of consistency between employment and demographic pressure exacerbates the challenges that this region is currently confronted with. In this region, 500 million people are impacted by multidimensional poverty. So these topics are very important, and they are being analyzed by the United Nations for Sustainable Development. And these are topics that governments should have been working on for decades. Progress have been insufficient, and I think this is what our panelists are about to talk about. Thank you. Thank you, Marie-Françoise, for this very complete summary. Ravindra, you know Asia very well as the French society. According to you, what are the main issues when talking of hypermodernity in Asia, and how do we compare it to the situation in Europe? Thank you for your question, Madoka, and I'm thrilled to be at the economic encounters with such diverse panelists. Before answering your question, I'd like to define what Asia means. Lately, many authors have written on the topic. 30 years ago, the current Prime Minister of Malaysia described Asia and talked of Asia's rebirth. Another author talked of the Asian miracle, and recently we've been talking of the new Asia. So it's really interesting to see this change, this evolution in the way we describe Asia between 30 years ago and nowadays, where everyone's talking of Asia as being the new center, whether geopolitical, economic, political, in the world. So in my intervention, I'd like to talk of three things. Firstly, I will talk of demographics. Secondly, of climate. And thirdly, of technology. In terms of demographics, Asia is progressing on two fronts. Firstly, we have Southeast Asia with a very young population, median age of about 23 years old. So Southeast Asia right now is 11 countries because Timor-Leste recently joined ASEAN. And on the contrary, we have Northern Asia, Japan, China, Singapore, with the exception of Singapore, that has an aging population where the median age is about 44 years old. So when we compare it with Europe, Europe is much more uniform with an average age of 44 years old, which is why the silver economy, so the economy targeting older people, is an economy that is flourishing currently in Europe. One last point when it comes to demographics. Having a young population is something interesting only if you capitalize on demographic dividends and specifically on education. I think that's a huge point. Second point, and I'd like to talk of climate. About a week ago, we had 43 Celsius here. Apparently, this is the new standard. We have trends indicating about 50 Celsius in Europe and in Paris. Apparently, infrastructure that we currently have in Paris within 10 years will not be able to resist, and that will be a huge issue, including in the French capital city. So that's something we have to get used to. Unfortunately, we have to find ways to mitigate the risks. And on the climate front, I think one thing is very clear. According to a report, 43% of climate disasters have happened in Asia. China lately, we've had flooding. In Thailand, in Vietnam lately, we've had a typhoon in the Philippines. We've had an earthquake in Japan. So we are experiencing increasingly extreme climate events. That's an important thing to take into account. Europe lately also has had a lot of flooding in France, in Spain, but much less so than Asia. So, on the climate front, it is important to anticipate the risks. One very good example that happened in Europe is the Green Compact. By 2050, the idea is to reduce carbon emissions by 50%. We've had examples like Germany, which is on a good path, on a good trajectory to reach that goal. I think the Green Compact is an example we could replicate in Asia. Asia is currently lacking regionally such a compact, or continentally it's lacking such a compact. It's rather they have climate plans country by country. And one last thing on China. This is quite paradoxical because China indeed is one of the global polluters, but on the other hand, it's also one of the main producers of solar and wind energy. And additionally, BYD, the Chinese electric vehicle maker, has surpassed Tesla in terms of sales last year. So that's another important point. Maybe Europe should be careful not to be too dependent on China. Maybe it should diversify climate-wise and transport-wise. One last thing, maybe more on the technological front. Two examples show us the vitality of the Asian continent in terms of smart cities. We have some very clear examples of cities like Singapore, Shenzhen, or Ho Chi Minh. A lot of startup incubators, and in Jakarta as well, a lot of entrepreneurs. And of course, it depends on the size of the population, but all these cities show that technologically these cities are representing entrepreneurs and AI players. We have to realize that in China in 2024, I'm about to wrap up. In 2025, there are about over 300 unicorns, which are companies that are capitalized at over 1 billion, when in Europe we have only 150 of those. Finally, to conclude, I would like to end on a beautiful notion, and I want to honor Edgar Morin, who left us recently, who talked of this concept in his book in 1993. He explained that all crises would converge eventually. So to answer that notion, three things. We need to firstly collaborate. Ravintra. I would love to keep listening to you, but we have very little time. I will give you the floor for a second round of questions later on. Now, I would like to ask you, for the private sector in Korea, what are the reactions from businesses, from Korean businesses, when they're faced with the current geopolitical situation and trade tensions?
Thank you, Maruka. Um, I think talking about Korea-US relations and Korean companies' reaction on Trump administration is a lot helpful in explaining Asia's fragility that we are facing overall. If I may go back to Korea's fragility 1.0, that would be Korean War in the 1950s, which divided Korea into two. And in Korean Peninsula, South Korea is facing China, Russia, and North Korea in the north. And at the same time, US has the biggest troop in Pyeongtaek, Korea, that is the biggest size outside of the United States territory. So in this situation, when President Trump elevated a lot of trade measures on China, a lot of Korean companies actually were in trouble. That is because Korea's economy and Korea's companies had a lot of manufacturing facilities in China, and our economy was a lot entangled both with the United States and China. So when President made it very difficult to for China to export its semiconductors, the problem was that Samsung at that moment produced about 40% of its NAND flash memory back in China, and at the same time, another semiconductor giant of Korea, SK Hynix, produced about 40% of DRAM and 20% of NAND flash memory back in China, which were also exported to US and other parts of the world. In that chance, it was very difficult for Korea to export its own Samsung or SK Hynix semiconductor from China to the US. So back then, I was engaged in Korea-US relations, and I remember delivering a lot of our position papers to persuade Washington that Korea's economy actually benefited and contributed a lot to the US economy. And back then, a lot of Korean companies also had huge investment plans to the US, which became burdens to South Korean companies. Right now, supply chain shift is going on. So we are moving a lot of factories from China, outside of China, to Eastern Europe, like Hungary, Poland, and that is still going on. I think such a move nowadays, I would say, is very successful. You might hear that Korea's stock market has been skyrocketed this year, driven largely by Samsung and SK Hynix. And I think in Korea's case, we can see that there are huge demands from other parts of the world that they want AI sovereignty or AI technology outside of two great powers, that is US and China. So I think such a shift from fragility to hypermodernity is very successful, and I would like to share my views on how to survive from now on. I will share in my latter part of the conversation. Thank you.
Merci les jeunes, c'est vraiment un défi commun entre
Thank you very much. That is indeed a common challenge between Europe and Asia, how to deal with the US, with China, the major players in the world. So now, Yuan Jaikai, to answer the vulnerabilities that Marie-Françoise exemplified earlier, I think philanthropy has a huge role to play in that sense. Could you enlighten us when it comes to how the private sector philanthropics have evolved currently?
Thank you. So first of all, I just wanted to say that it's my third time back in a province. It's always a nice experience to be back, and it's a privilege to be part of this distinguished panel. And I'm just feeling lucky that I'm actually from the philanthropy space. Otherwise, it'll be a very tough discussion today since I'm from China. China's philanthropy really did not exist until about less than 20 years ago. That was 2008. It was the Wenchuan earthquake. It really sort of initiated the private philanthropy in China, because at the time, general public are no longer satisfied with the efficiency and transparency that all the traditional foundations like China Red Cross and all these sort of government affiliated agencies, and then really that was the time private philanthropy started to take off. And I'm sure like all the trade successes and economic success that everybody's talking about here, I think it's no doubt that China, especially the private sector, has accumulated a tremendous amount of wealth. But the first generation Chinese entrepreneurs are well, they are entrepreneurs, right? So even though they're in their late 60s, early 70s, and they're still busy, making their financial successes. But what we see, the most interesting catalyst in our space is the second generation. Because as you know, we have the sort of the one-child policy, goes way back. So all the first generation Chinese successful entrepreneurs, they treat their kids carefully, meaning their education very carefully. So I would say almost 80 or 90% of this generation of entrepreneurs, second generation, were educated in the West. And unlike their parents, they are very different from their parents. Maybe because their education, maybe because they're a second generation. So from a lot of my conversations with this group, they care a lot more than just money. I mean, a lot of the things they care about, climate, health, art, culture. This group is very different from the first generation. Obviously, they have their challenges. They have a huge shadow to deal with. Given the success of their parents, and also mostly because they're the only child. If you're the only child, then the pressure is tremendous. But we do see that this is a huge catalyst. Happening in the philanthropy world in China, and we are spending a huge amount of time to grow with this generation. Because as you asked me earlier before the session, what's the difference between Chinese philanthropy and US philanthropy and European philanthropy? As I just said, we are only less than 20 years old. Unlike Ford Foundation, Rockefeller Foundation, all these established foundations, there's so much to learn. And also, I think the professionals within the sector still need to learn as well. That's why we're very actively to engage with US fellow foundations, as well as European foundations, as well as families, so that we create a trust space so that these second generation entrepreneurs, they can really learn and also to start doing their philanthropic initiatives.
C'est très encourageant qu'il y a une nouvelle sensibilité.
Very encouraging there's a new sensitivity and a new approaches developed in the second generation of Chinese entrepreneurs. Monsieur Devin, when we talk about hypermodernity in Asia, Singapore is probably one of the first countries we think of. It's not just because you're the major hub for international financing and international trade, but Singaporean society is very diverse in terms of ethnicity, with Malays and India and Chinese citizens. How much has that contributed to your economic model, and what are the challenges for you?
Let me first begin by emphasizing that Singapore is a very, very small place. I checked the statistics this morning. We are only about 3 times the size of Marseille. But if you include metropolitan Marseille, which includes this city, you're almost 50% larger than Singapore. So that's how small we are. We are about the only city-state in existence in the world. There is only the city, and there is no outside to the city. There is no country beyond the city. That is not how we want it to be. I mean, the founding generation of modern Singapore thought that we should be part of Malaysia. That didn't work out, and we found ourselves independent in 1965. You must have all have heard of how hyper-modern Singapore is, and it is. It's a highly successful economy. When we began in 1965, we had a per capita GDP of about 500 US dollars. Now, 60 years later, we have a per capita GDP in excess of $100,000 USD. So it's a tremendous leap. And we could not have become what we have if we had not been an open economy. Singapore as closed society is an impossibility. You can't survive as a city-state, the only city-state in existence. I like to say the only other city-state is the Vatican City. And unlike us, they have a direct line to God. So, we can't survive other than as an open society. Just to give you one indication of what that means, the total value of our trade is 3 times Singapore's GDP. So there is no other country that is as open in terms of trade as we are, just by measuring the value of trade relative to your GDP. One of the things that we have done well, as the chair alluded to, is bringing together a very diverse population. Singapore has always been diverse. We have always, according to Pew research, we are the religiously most diverse society in the world. And racially, we are diverse too. There are all kinds of nationalities in Singapore. And we have achieved this relative religious and racial harmony, not merely because we encourage people to love each other. The government of the day, over the past 60 years, has taken rather drastic measures. People have been told what language they can speak. We were a former British colony, and unlike most other former British colonies, Singapore decided to make English the language of the colonizer, the language of government, the language of business, the language of education, the language of your laws, everything. Your native languages are so-called mother tongues, but for most people, they are the second language in Singapore, increasingly. We tell people where they can live to prevent ghettos from forming, racial ghettos. So every public housing estate in Singapore cannot have beyond a certain proportion of whether it's Chinese, Malays, or Indians. So there are very drastic things that the government did in order to have the peace and stability that we have had. This does not mean that we are without problems. Hypermodernity comes with its vulnerabilities. It's not an either-or situation. It comes with its vulnerabilities. We are the most open society probably in the world. But that has created a reaction from the population. We have taken in immigrants. That has created a reaction. Not only migrant workers for construction and so on, but also foreigners of all nationalities for your high tech, your finance, your academics, and so on. I mean, about 45% of the Singapore population is not Singaporean, more than 45%. And that will probably grow simply because our TFR, our fertility rate has fallen probably below 0.8. And so, just to make up for the numbers, you'll have to depend on immigration. But that has caused a reaction. And I was struck just now, the plenary session, when one of the main speakers said that in France, 50% of the French do not believe in progress because they don't see themselves benefiting from progress. We have avoided the extremes that you see in many European countries, but only because, well, we've been lucky. We have income inequality, but we have also have measures that have moderated income inequalities. We have a public housing policy that provides housing for 80% of the population. And it's very high quality housing, and people end up owning their property. So there is considerable wealth accumulation. But still, the pressure grows because income inequalities have become so stretched that you have people at the very top being able to give their children life experiences that are not available to children, even forget about the lower working class, but even middle class. And so you have to do a great deal to intervene at a very early age to try and equalize the difference. It's not easy. So far, we have managed to avoid the kinds of political extremes that you see in many countries, including in Europe, including in France, and amazingly enough, even in Germany. But it is not as though we are without risk, that we have overcome this. Only recently, quite out of the blue, controversy emerged in Singapore. Chinese media, PRC Chinese media, started broadcasting the fact that, claiming that there are too many Indians in Singapore. Actually, they mean Indian migrants. Actually, there are too many Indians in almost every city, state in the world which has tech. There are too many Indians, there are too many Chinese. But that became an issue. And Singaporeans said, yeah, that's a point, there are too many Indians. So it's very fragile. So my message to you would be very simple. The fact that this can happen in Singapore means that it can happen everywhere. The biggest danger to multilateral systems, to globalization, I would say, is not just Donald Trump, but political fractures that can emerge in different societies. Political fractures that can emerge primarily because, as the distinguished speaker just now said, substantial portion of your population feel they can no longer believe in progress. Yeah. So I'll stop at that point.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Devin. I would ask you later. Je vais vous demander plus tard les solutions que vous pouvez proposer.
So, Dr. Conter, women's living conditions in Asia have improved a great deal, and this is maybe a hidden lever in Asia. Maybe you'll agree with me. What more do you think we could do for the younger generations of the girls of Asia, in Cambodia in particular? Good evening, everybody. I'm delighted to be here. It's the first time I've participated in these rencontres. I'm going to answer this from a feminine point of view. My colleagues have talked about economic issues in hypermodernity. I'm going to talk about the feminine outlook. The Asian continent is a huge continent with huge cultural diversity and very different levels of economic development. Unfortunately, despite this hypermodernity and the technological progress and economic development, the progress for women has been very, very slow. And I think we share many similarities between different countries. These are because of structural barriers. I'd like to respond to the Professor Anamar said in Madame Rapport said the gender inequalities have not been mitigated since the beginning of the century, and in Asia, Southeast Asia, 34% in Southeast Asia and 35% in Central Asia. Why is this? Because there are structural barriers for women. The question is that hypermodernity is moving forward quickly. The question is, are our societies capable of following this level of technological and economic development? Is there inclusion in this development? The question is, are all of the population benefiting from this innovation and getting access to this innovation? And this is the problem for women in Asia, is that there is a digital divide between men and women, because there is a professional segregation. There's always been a tradition for women to do certain professions and men to do other professions. This also comes from women themselves, who don't really see themselves as having a profession in science. And if you look at education, you have women and girls in the science, technology, information, and mathematics and physics. There are very few women in these disciplines. In Cambodia, we have only 17% of women students who study in these disciplines. This is why we have this digital divide between men and women. Unfortunately, it represents something that hinders innovation. And we know there are research data that are very clear from the OECD and the World Bank and McKinsey and the World Economic Forum, which show that when women participate and lead companies, the companies have better performance, innovation accelerates, and the economy benefits.
We also have the UNESCO research, and the High Commissioner for Human Rights have showed that when women contribute to modeling AI, technology becomes more ethical. And it's becoming an issue at the moment. I'll talk about it later. And it becomes more human-centered as well when women are involved. So I think that Asia cannot afford to leave by the wayside half of its talent. We talk of demographic dividend. We talk of population. Over 50% of the population are women and girls. There's also underway a demographic change in Asia, and specifically in Southeast Asia. Demographics are falling. I think the birth rate in Korea, Northern Asia, I think it's less than one. Less than one for the birth rate. Singapore as well, less than one. And Japan has slightly more than one, 1.1 for the moment. In Cambodia for the moment, we're still happy because we have 2.5 still for the moment, so it's above average, but in most countries, as we said, economic development is varied in Asia. So the more developed the countries are, the lesser they have birth rate, and the question of the aging population is then raised. And we know that demographics is not a social issue, it's an economic issue. We talk of resilience. Demographic resilience can be improved when women have autonomy, opportunity, and protection, which leads to stronger families, higher productivity, and more stable societies. I also talked of a structural barrier. The weight of domestic work is still very much relying on women's shoulders. In many Asian societies, we are in patriarchal societies, so women are seen as household women, even if they have a profession. So they have 5 times more unpaid work, unpaid home care, which limits their ability to work outside of the home and to fully participate in the economic life. Another trap that we want to highlight in South Asia and Southeast Asia, the informal sector is an issue. The informal economic sector, it is a trap, unfortunately, because we're talking of modernity, but that group of people that works in the informal sector is very far from receiving any benefits from this innovation. For example, in Cambodia, I'm sorry, I have to interrupt you. Just on the economic front, just to say that the informal economic sector represents 40% of GDP in Cambodia and about 88% of total employment. So it is huge. And yes, we talk of hypermodernity, but we also should work towards formalizing this informal economy. And since we talk of violence, in progress, we always have a side effect. And the side effect currently is violence being facilitated by technology, and especially towards women, girls, and children. And I think that's a responsibility that lies on the entire society, not just one institution. The entire society has to be responsible for it, and in particular megatech companies, they have to share that responsibility when they create new digital tools. Thank you very much, Madam Minister. I think we fully agree on that last point. Very briefly, I'd like to invite all panelists to share what you think on how we can overcome this period of vulnerability in Asia. Ravindra? That is a difficult question because vulnerability, we can see it on the geopolitical front in the Asian region and in particular in Southeast Asia. Recent conflicts between the Thai border and Cambodian border, we've also seen it in the Indo-Pacific. That's a playing field between two major powers, US and China. We also see it in Taiwan, in the southern China Sea, and the Middle East is also part of Asia with the Strait of Hormuz recently and everything that's happened. Everything is being reshuffled and everything is very fragile. So these conflict zones, of course, they have an impact on the economy. But for everything, we also have a plus side. So yes, that's a vulnerability, but also a strength, because Asia is both the new economic center of gravity with 3 examples, the new Silk Roads created by China, linking up over 100 countries with infrastructure development projects, with roads and with ports. Second example, an alternative to the new Silk Roads, it is the Europe, India and Middle East corridor, which was put in place by Narendra Modi, the Indian Prime Minister, during the G20 in 2025. And then lately, the free trade, one of the major global free trade agreements was signed between China, Southeast Asia, New Zealand, Australia, South Korea. It represents 30% of global GDP. So those 3 examples are very concrete examples that show that the new economic center of gravity is in Asia. Thank you, Ravindra. Yijun, do you see potential cooperations between Asian countries, European countries, to overcome their current challenges?
I would say coalition of middle powers in Asia is the way to go, to overcome the fragility that now we are facing. I would like to just mention 2 bilateral relations. First, Korea-Japan relations. Second, Korea-France relations. Right now, at the moment, Korea-Japan relations haven't been this rosy before. So both countries didn't get along before, but nowadays, like, I haven't seen this kind of good relationship between 2 countries. That is because, like, both countries share like similar goals to get away from Washington and Beijing, and also try to reject hegemony. So in this situation, I think both countries can create a huge wave of middle powers. We can extend this to India, Southeast Asia altogether. And next, I would like to mention about Korea-France relations. And this year is very special in that this is 140th anniversary of Korea-France bilateral relations, and both countries have elevated its status as global strategic partnership. The potential area of cooperation can be AI sovereignty. So both countries are striving hard to make independent AI model where we can independent from both great powers, China and the US. So like for example, like Mistral AI from France is constantly cooperating with the companies like Samsung, SK, and Naver, like Korean version of Mistral AI. So if we can like bring together middle powers from Asia to Europe, like starting from the huge engine, France, Germany, I think we can limit uncertainty in the time of huge uncertainty between two great powers. Thank you.
Thank you. Merci. Alors, Jekai, nous avons pas.
Thank you. Jakai, we haven't talked of China very much. There's a disconnect from China, between the rest of the world and China. What can we do to promote more dialogue?
Thank you. I'll just be brief because I think at this moment, geopolitically, economically, there are so many uncertainties. But I do believe that at this moment, building people-to-people connection is more important than ever. And especially, I mean, the group, the second generation entrepreneur group that I just mentioned. I just give the audience an example. Just last month, we convened the top 35 families in China, their second generation. And we convened a reception in Hong Kong. And they met with the top 10 families in Hong Kong. Even PRC and Hong Kong families, there's so many differences. And we found that having this community really allowed them to communicate, exchange dialogues, I mean, among them. And despite all the differences, when they talk about family succession, I mean, surprisingly, I mean, a lot of things they talk about are the same. So this is just a starting point. And we are aiming, really aiming to convene this group to go to the rest of the region and also go to the rest of the world because, I mean, these people are going to be the forefront for Chinese economies as well as the 300 unicorns you just mentioned, right? So I do think that having these young people building trust with their peers is going to be a very important aspect of the future of the region.
Ah, merci, Jekai. Peut-être sur la même.
Thank you, Jakai. Mr. Devan, what would be the solutions when we're faced with this current fragmentation that we're seeing at the moment?
3 points. Number one, I don't think tensions between the United States and China will lessen the moment Donald Trump leaves the White House. I think that is not likely. That doesn't mean the rest of Asia should be helpless. We have agency. We should try as much as possible to avoid choosing between the two, or as long as possible, if ever, forever if possible. Number two, I would like to voice again what was said earlier. We should try and establish as many links as possible among middle powers, and not only among middle powers or small powers, but also between Europe and Asia, and try and create as many coalitions of the willing and the sensible and the rational as we can manage on a whole variety of issues, not only economic, not only strategic, but also climate, sustainability, all kinds of things. The rule of law, freedom of navigation, all those things. Finally, I want to repeat what I said earlier. Every society, or as many societies as possible, must have to strive to make sure that the fruits of progress is shared with as many of their people as possible. Actually, that task is going to get even harder with AI. But if we don't do that, if you have societies fracturing as a result of income inequality, you will have political fractures, and the political fractures, internal political fractures, will in fact result in tensions, security tensions across Asia and perhaps the world.
Okay. Yeah. Merci, merci. Alors, Madame la...
Thank you, Madam Minister. You said that birth rate was critical for women in society. What's the solution? Thank you. The solution is difficult to find and it takes a long time when demographics are declining. I think we should take into account the fact that demographic challenges in Asia are related to gender issues. I think all countries agree on this point. And we should also see women differently. We should see them as pillars of demographic and family resilience. So we have to keep that vision in mind. We should also put in place a policy in favor of birth to focus on domestic work which is unpaid. So we need to educate our societies, all our societies. It's an education that needs to happen. Domestic work needs to be shared between men and women. And of course, there's a new trend as well currently. It's what we call in English the care economy. So we need to focus on human beings' well-being, on the person's well-being, to focus on the family's well-being. So how can we promote the notion of family at the moment? Because a family that is stable, that is happy, makes the entire community, the entire society more stable and more prosperous. My country has started putting into place structures for childcare, as well as promoting professions for older people care, which for the moment that type of care is relying very much on unpaid work by women. We've done it, and in China and in South Korea they've also financed public systems for childcare and older persons care. And in my country as well, we're doing it. South Korea, Japan have also introduced more progressive parental leave and including paternal leave that is non-transferable. So you can use it or not, but you cannot give it to your wife. So you have to use it. Generally, fathers do take that parental leave, and it means there is more sharing of the responsibility. And it doesn't penalize what we call the motherhood penalty. So it shouldn't be penalizing women. At the moment, some countries, I'm not sure which ones exactly, but in some countries, companies do not promote women, especially when they are of reproductive age, because they do not want these women to be in the company for 1 or 2 years and then to have to leave. So they do not promote women and they do not hire women as well. So that parental leave helps share that responsibility, share that burden, and maybe generate a new vision within companies. We also have to look into working hours arrangements. In Asian countries, companies usually have a culture that promotes very long hours, very rigid hours. They also want employees to be in person in the company. Maybe we should be promoting remote work. This morning during the opening session, I've heard the anthropologist say that during COVID we favored remote work, and in the US there were 300,000 additional births. So it goes to show the stress that men and women are under when they have to go to work in person. So because of stress, sometimes it leads to hormonal dysfunctions, which leads to less births. So we need to have policies that favor birth rates. It will depend on the countries, it will depend on the cultural and traditional structures as well. Thank you very much, Madam Minister. Marie-Françoise, in a few words, could you summarize this very complete full session? Thank you to our panelists that made comments and proposals. They were very interesting. I cannot summarize everything. There was too much, but I have just kept a few things in mind. I think firstly, the first question is who benefits from hypermodernity and from technical progress in Asia? It seems just a small part of the population. So seeking technical progress was done very often without wondering about its impact on population and without wondering about who will benefit from it and which social fractures could be created as a result. And the result is a strong fragmentation of population between those who benefit from progress and those who are left by the wayside. And that fragmentation is extremely dangerous for social stability. There is not enough education, too much informal economies, too many women being left by the side, and those are issues that can stop countries from developing and lead to a type of violence that, as Madam Minister said, is facilitated by new technologies as well. So it is urgent. We need to find answers to these questions. Thank you. Do we have enough time for a question in the room from the audience? Please go ahead, sir. I have a question. Can you hear me? Unfortunately, you won't have time to answer it. We've seen the damage on the global economy from the stoppage of the Strait of Hormuz. You all know the Malacca dilemma. 80% of global trade is going through containers. We can never say never. We never believed the war in Ukraine would happen, and it did. Are there countries outside of China that are already planning on storing cereals, raw material, petrol like China is doing? Of course, that might be confidential, but nothing is secret at the moment. So this is a question. You won't answer that question because we would need an entire hour. But this is a question that meets at the center of economy and geopolitics, and which is huge for your region and even more important for your region, because if Malacca, the Strait of Malacca is blocked, there is no Suez, there is no Cape, there is nothing. It's the very end of everything. So it might last 3-4 months. 3-4 months is a very long time. So I think you have so many smart people in your countries that you might be planning for it. Generally, as soon as a crisis erupts, we react and then we forget about it as soon as it's over. So I'm not going to ask you to answer because we don't have enough time, but maybe we'll talk about it later this evening. Would you like to add any comment to that?
Since I am on the Straits of Malacca, I suppose I should answer that question. A blockage of the Straits of Malacca is very serious. It probably result in war. As for whether or not many countries are storing up petroleum and other vital products, I assume all of them are. If they aren't, then those governments should be booted out. Of course they have to. And some of these agreements are public. For example, Singapore, very small, but we have a petroleum refining capacity. A big country like Australia doesn't. And so we recently had agreement with Australia to guarantee them supply of petroleum in case of shortages, in return for them guaranteeing supply of gas, which they have a lot of, and also food, of which we have none.
Merci. Malheureusement.
Thank you. Unfortunately, we are reaching the end of this session. Dear panelists, you've really helped me understand that we believe in progress. We believe in a better future for Asia, and I think that is the strength of our continent indeed. Thank you to all, and thank you to the audience.